Hi everybody, welcome to this live presentation. Today I want to be talking about the history and the future of the Kazakh language. And so as a bit of a uh, an introduction, or as to give you a table of contents about what we'll be talking about today, I want to go over the pre-modern history of the Kazakh language and the history in general. Then we're going to talk about the colonial literary influences. After this, we'll talk about Ahmet Baitursun and his role. Then we'll talk about the Azerbaijani connection, and this is something that I don't think you may have been aware of in the past, and so that's one of the new pieces of information that this conference, I hope, can shed light on for you. Then we'll talk about script comparisons between, Latin, Cyrillic, and Arabic. We'll speak briefly about the pre-reform Arabic alphabet, because that's a piece of novel research that our group has been doing. And then I'll sort of give the introductions to our group. So to not waste too much time, and I should preface that the presentation would or will have around a 10 to 20-second delay. I timed it myself inside 13 seconds. So if you post a question or something like that, and I don't see it, just let me know, and I'll be sure to get to it whenever I can. So without further ado, two things I just need to make clear is that Kazakh language, unlike many other languages, has a pretty rich oral literature and written literature, and the history is kind of split between these two. One thing that's unique about it tends to be a blend of oral and written literature. So for people who grow up in text-centric societies, they tend to be dismissive of oral literature, and they tend not to see its utility. Now, this oral literature, which basically means, verbally passing down information and stories and legends and mythologies through word of mouth, right? So it can be a useful source of preserving knowledge, especially when it doesn't make logistical sense to have a large portion of society sitting there and learning how to read and write. It's quite well suited to the nomadic way of life. However, despite the nomadic past, Kazakhstan does have a substantial history of written literature as well, which is what we're here to talk about. Yeah, so I'm not here to debate the merits of oral versus written literature, but rather here to shed light for an English-speaking audience, the diverse nature of Kazakhstan's written literature, the history, and the future. So to just look at a glance, this is the timeline that we can sort of take into consideration. This is a good breakdown of the time periods by which we can classify Kazakh literature. And let's just jump right into it. So first we have the Orkhon script from the 5th to 8th century. And according to Chinese sources from this time period, the Turkic tribes of Kazakhstan had an oral poetry tradition. And so these came from earlier periods where stories were primarily transmitted by bards, who were professional storytellers and music performers. And traces of this tradition are shown in the Orkhon script stone carvings that are dated to the 5th and 7th centuries. And these describe the reigns of some early Turkic rulers. So this is what was used in antiquity. And then the Golden Horde, right? So this is a new period for Kazakh literature, one that saw the arrival of Islam and the Mongolian, a lot of Mongolian influence as well. And so we saw the introduction of the Arabic script over the Old Turkic runes that were being used. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Codex Cumanicus, which is pretty important. But first, I'd like to cover some works that were done in the Kazakh language, which are, as such, Al-Khwarizmi's Muhabbat Nameh. Then we have works like Qutb's Khosrow and Shirin, then Durbek's Yusuf and Zulekha, and then Qisas al-Anbiya. And these were some works that were done in the Kazakh language. Now, at the time, during the Golden Horde, it was a Chagatai language that really reigned supreme. But you'd still see people writing in their native languages or dialects. Rather, you could see the influences in these as well. So I think it's just important to point that out. And another common sort of point of writing, or some, I guess, written literature, if you will, was the documents delineating family sort of these family bloodlines, and these were called shajire. Right? I think it comes from an Arabic word. Don't quote me on that. Sorry. Uh, and there was also ethical and didactic epics and Sufi of Sufi wisdom, moral and then philosophical works, these came to life in the Islamic era, and they found logical and historical artistic continuation for many of the Kazakh poems, as was. So I think by this point, I'd like to sort of do away with the assumption that Kazakh had virtually no written footprint before the 19th century. This couldn't be more untrue. It may not have been as robust as some of the other sort of sedentary countries, and maybe if you compare it to Persian literature or Arabic literature, there was less at the time. But nonetheless, I still think we can point to a body of work and say that, yes, this is Kazakh literature, definitively. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Codex Cumanicus. Not too many things, since it is really only one document, but this was it was written in Kuman, which is a Kipchak language, so maybe not quite Kazakh, but it's related, right? It's not irrelevant. And it was written in Crimea, so, that strip of land that Russia, kind of the whole focal point between tensions between Russia and Ukraine. That's the geographical location where it was written. And it was a linguistic manual of the Middle Ages used for Catholic missionaries who were preaching to the Turkic peoples at the time. And so this was written in the Latin alphabet, whereas everything else was being written in the Arabic alphabet. Sorry about that. So in the Kazakh Khanate, this was from the 15th to 19th century. Mainly what we saw here, this was sort of the consolidation of the Kazakh nation coming into its own. Everything that you see here is kind of more unique to Kazakhstan. And many nations at the time, they kind of had their own national identities being consolidated here. And we mainly saw oral poetry. We saw written literature being carried as well, although it's primarily oral. I do want to just stress that, but there were a few literate bards, and their works have been preserved. I'm not going to go too much into them because I actually myself I had a lot of difficulty finding these. So if you can find these and send them my way, that'd be very welcome. And so now we're moving on to the modern period. Right, and this is between the 19th and I guess the 21st centuries, and this timeline can also be broken down a little bit too. So of course we had Turkic ruins, and then we had the Golden Horde and the Kazakh Khanate. But I want to go over to the 1800s, where we began seeing more written literature. This kind of coincides with increased Russian control or influence over Kazakhstan, and we'll see some more influence from Tatar intellectuals and academia as well. And this results in a bit of a flourishing of the literature. So in 1912, a new phonetic alphabet based on the Arabic alphabet was created for Kazakhstan. This resulted in even more literature, right? Because it's now more accessible and easier to print in. And you saw many more things being printed and written. So then in 1929 to 1940, the Latin alphabet was adopted. And I should add that the USSR came to power sometime between 1918 and between 1917 to 1919. That's kind of when their hold was consolidated. But anyways, the Latin alphabet was introduced in 1929 to 1940, and then from 1940 to the present day, we are using the Cyrillic alphabet for the Kazakh language. So I want to briefly talk about the blossoming of the Kazakh literature from the 1800s to the 1900s, as it's primarily written in the Arabic script. And again, I want to just emphasize the point that this wasn't a stagnant field at all. There were a lot of rich themes and a variety of literary works composed. The poets at the time did a great job in skillfully linking the depictions of modern reality, and they had a lot of enriching realism, and they found a lot of innovations in the language, right? One point I want to make is that the politics of the region also colored the literary history as well. Some of the poets were afraid of the colonizers, but due to their familiarity with Oriental literature and the samples of religious literature, they created works of high artistic value that came to the political forefront. And so a lot of the folk poetry that was born in connection with the uprisings complemented the democratic folk direction of the literature at the beginning of the century. And so all I'm really trying to emphasize here is that there was a rich and blossoming literary scene that wasn't really stagnant and sort of non-existent, as the claim was made. So very briefly, just to address some of the early literary backdrop, was the Russian annexation of Kazakhstan or Turkestan, whatever you will, right? And a lot of the early Kazakh literature is characterized by anti-colonial sentiments. We'll see some literature coming out of this region. Bukay, a region which was actually part of Russia at the time, but it was settled by Kazakh people, so we can consider it to be sort of Kazakh in nature. So the Russian annexations would bring new conflict, but also new literature, and we see the rise of anti-colonial poetry, right? So anti-colonial poetry was a new milestone in the development of the Kazakh literary language with its advanced ideas and folk content. So the reasons for these uprisings that I've put here were things like the land crisis, tax burden, sort of the arbitrariness of the Tsarist officials, the harassment of ordinary peoples and farmers, of just ordinary peoples. Jahangir Khan was one of the deputies, not deputy, that's an inappropriate way to explain his relationship, but he was one of the sort of collaborators with the Tsarist authorities, who acted in quite an oppressive manner toward the Kazakh people in general. And so this resulted in an uprising against his reign. Right? There was resistance against both misdeeds by occupiers, but also local corrupt khans who were working with the colonial authorities. And so the literature of this era was composed mainly by the warrior poets, and we see those here. And so one more stop I want to make in our journey between the between the 1800s and 1900s was Abay Kunan Bayolu. He was a teacher, poet, educator, and really we can consider him the founder of the written Kazakh literature. His main contribution lies in poetry. He expressed great nationalism and popularized the written language. He also translated a fair bit of works from Russian to Kazakh, and he had a lot of creative poetry that affected the philosophical and theological thinking of educated Kazakhs. I think, he's way more important than I'm simply covering right now. And I wish I could do him more justice, but unfortunately, I think we're a little bit pressed for time, so I'm not going to talk too much. I'm not going to spend too much time on him. And so this is sort of the early 1900s and the late 1800s summed up a little bit. And so I've put some publications for you on the right side over here. These were all written in the pre-reform alphabet. If you remember, I mentioned the Kazakh language had its alphabet reformed. And so these were some of the works that were done before this time period. So I think just a general gist, it's highly inappropriate to dismiss Kazakh literature as stagnant or barren or devoid of any life before the USSR had stepped in. From an outsider perspective, it does seem like the Kazakh people were forging their own literary culture as they transitioned from a nomadic lifestyle to a more settled lifestyle. But we'll explore how that may have been interrupted. But I do want to talk about the new era of Kazakh literature. This happened in 1912, and this was sort of ushered in by Ahmet Baitursunov. He had drafted a reformed version of the Arabic alphabet, which is what you see in front of you here right now. So this was the first fully phonetic alphabet for the Kazakh language. What he had done is that he had excluded all purely Arabic and Persian letters that were not being used in Kazakh, and he also added a few specific letters that they needed. And most of the future alphabets that were designed for the Kazakh language were done so by simply directly copying this alphabet. That's just how good it was. And so the alphabet was named Tote Jazu, please don't skewer me on the pronunciation. I'm not a native Kazakh speaker. Um, so I will be pronouncing these words with an accent. So please, if you can just bear with me and forgive me, I would really appreciate that. But this alphabet is actually still used today by Kazakh people in China, Afghanistan, and Iran. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit more about Ahmet Baitursunov. This brings us to the man behind the alphabet. He was a linguist born in the Kostanay region of Kazakhstan. He learned literacy from the village mullahs, and he eventually became a language teacher. And the reason I want to cover his life is because it's an unfortunate analogy. Unfortunately, it's an accurate analogy for kind of what happened to the development of the Kazakh language, of the Kazakh language's alphabet. But aside this, he was a great visionary and reformer, and he did a lot of good work for the language. A lot of the sort of scientific terminology and grammatical terminology that's being used for Kazakh today was developed by him. So many of the words that we simply use to describe the language and to work with it, right, from a scientific perspective, these were drafted by him. So I think to that, in that right, we can thank him for a lot of contributions to the Kazakh language. Now, again, talking a little bit more about the history, his troubles with the law began as early as 1905, and I think he was imprisoned from 1905 to 1909, but he found a way to really make the most of his time imprisonment. He was exiled from Kazakhstan, and he was sort of, I think he had been forced to go to Orenburg, which was in Russia proper. And in exile, he wrote for ICOP, and he worked on a few publications. And then when he returned, right after 1917, and so 1917 also coincides with almost a year before, or sometime around the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. So by this point, the Tsarist regime is kind of falling apart. But so anyways, Ahmet Baitursunov, he returns to the steppe and he begins to work for Alash Orda, creating the Alash party. And he was beginning to sort of fight for the cause of Kazakh autonomy. And so just to maybe shine a little bit more light on his alphabet, so this was a 24-letter alphabet. This is a manuscript, or this is a textbook that was drafted in 1914. This wasn't the final version of his reformed alphabet, but it was sort of one stepping stone in the progress, right? Because prior to this point, Kazakhstan is writing in a modified version of the Chagatai alphabet, which itself was modified and based off the Persian alphabet. And so Chagatai, it was good for the Chagatai language, but for Kazakhstan, it did have a few deficiencies. There really weren't any letters that were missing per se. I wouldn't characterize it like that. It's the relationship is a little bit difficult to characterize. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the future. But for now, all you need to know is that it was sort of not phonetic, and Ahmet Baitursunov, he made it more phonetic. And this was a very strenuous process, and he did this sort of period of discovery within the Arabic alphabet. And so this was simply one of his tools. And again, I just want to mention that he drafted almost all existing grammatical terminology for the language. So now I want to get to the amnesty period of his life. He was granted amnesty, and he came back to Kazakhstan, and he became the commissioner of the Kazakh ASSR. He came back to his posts after the Tsarist regime was overthrown, and he began taking the newfound opportunity to serve his people. In that time, he began promoting the reformed Arabic script that he had created, Tejazu, which is this one. And he was given some senior posts until from 1920 till 1928. But between that period, right, again from 1920 to 1928, we notice an interesting shift in his works, and this important shift occurred in 1924. I'm not going to spoil what it was yet for you, but you should be able to observe some interesting trends that pretty much all start after 1924 that weren't there before that. I really can't do all of his contributions to the Kazakh language justice. That would really involve its own PowerPoint and presentation. I will have to unfortunately move on. And so unfortunately, he was he was killed. And on 1929, he and 43 other Polish Party activists were arrested in Almaty by the NKVD, which was the Russian or the Soviet secret police at the time, and they were sent to prison in Kazakh Orda. And he would be sort of thrown around in legal limbo for a good many years until the October of 1937, when he was summarily executed. And I think this was an apt sort of analogy for what had happened to his work and to his alphabet that he'd created, and to the history in general, right? So he'd contributed so much for the Kazakh people, only to be sort of thrown aside and murdered on false charges. And because I looked around it, I did my research, and I don't think I found any evidence to substantiate the claims that he was working against the either Soviet authorities or the country in general. And so I believe that he was wrongly imprisoned and executed, and essentially you can say that he was murdered. And so in 1924, with the death of Stalin, it was things like, with the death of Lenin and the rise of Stalin, it was events like this that became more common. So I do want to talk about the cooperation of the early Soviets and the Central Asians. So between 1916 and 1922, there was a sort of war in Central Asia. I'm going to broadly call it the Basmachi Rebellion. That's not entirely accurate, but I'll do it anyway. And so the Basmachi Rebellion was a rebellion against Russian rule and then later Soviet rule over Turkestan. And so the Soviets at some point were fearing a near total loss of the entire region. And the Soviets, I think they got together, they put their heads together, and they came to the conclusion that if they wanted to beat the Basmachis and take control of Turkestan, or of Central Asia in general, they needed to do some political and cultural reconciliation. They needed to give some concessions, along with some overwhelming, military force. So religious concessions were reinstated, right? Islamic practices were allowed to take place again, and Quran schools were reopened, and charity lands were restored. And this brought the Soviets the good faith of the Muslim peoples who were under their rule, and it made the Soviets more popular. So by this point, right, after the Soviets made these concessions, thousands of Muslims joined the USSR, and they quashed the Basmachi Rebellion against Russian rule. Now, this led to a brief period of Soviet cooperation with the Central Asians, right? A lot of good work was being done here. Schools were being built, railways were being built, and sort of a lot of the marvels of modern technology were pouring into Central Asia. And it was a really good relationship between the early Soviets and the Central Asians. And unfortunately, this changes in 1924. Lenin dies and Stalin comes into power. And this is when the persecutions and purges begin. Churches and mosques are destroyed, closed and demolished. There's mass deportations, secret police arrests, and massacres. And so the purges of the Muslim republics began in the 1928s. I think by this point, now that Soviet control had been a little bit more solidified, it was Stalin's calculation that he could betray the USSR's Muslim subjects with impunity. And he did. But I don't want to cover the political aspect. I want to actually cover now the linguistic angle of this. And so the linguistic arm of Stalinist policies culminated in the 1926 Baku Conference, right? So the motivation, the fundamental or underlying motivation of the USSR when it came to Turkic linguistic policy was to Latinize the Turkic languages. And this was done through things like the Baku Conference. So at the Baku Conference, they were debating, do we reform the Arabic alphabet or do we use a completely new alphabet? Before I go on any further, I want to pause here and remind you that, right, this conference is taking place in 1926. As I said for you, that a new reformed alphabet was already being drafted by 1912, right? This wasn't the final version of the alphabet, but it was pretty phonetic. It was pretty close. So I think this question should ring just a little bit hollow. But moving on, anyways, Soviet ideology posited that eventually, when humanity was at an advanced enough stage, all linguistic differences could be eliminated and all languages would eventually merge. I'm not entirely certain how much buy-in this had from the Soviet Union. To their credit, I don't think anybody expected this to happen like within their lifetimes, right? Surely even Stalin didn't think that this would happen in the next 20 or 50 years, right? But it was like an end goal. And one that I do take issue with because I think the diversity of cultures and languages should be respected, but nonetheless, I think this was their view, right? And so the USSR under Stalin was already organizing several linguistic conferences to Latinize various languages, right, by 1924. So by 1925, the Latin script was it was made the decision that the Caucasian languages need to change to the Latin alphabet. And this was done in a linguistic conference in 1925 for the Caucasians. And then in 1926, the turn of the Turkic republics would come. And so the USSR really used Azerbaijan to set the tempo of events going on in the Turkic world. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, but I need to first talk about one very enterprising politician. And his name is Samandagh Aghamedioglu. He was the organizer of the 1926 conference, right? This is some pictures of the conference over here. This is the guy that organized the whole thing. He was a chairman of the TSFSR and later served as a member of the USSR Central Executive Committee. He declared that the Romanization would be the central issue of the revolution in the East. He was staunchly committed to the alphabet reform in Azerbaijan, which prior to that was writing in a non-phonetic and unrefined version of the Arabic alphabet, which it didn't totally cater to the phonology of the Azeri language. It had many deficiencies, and so I think that was sort of his goal. He wanted to change this. So under the auspices of the Soviet initiative, he organized the 1926 First Turkological Congress in Baku, with the stated purpose of debating the merits of the Latin alphabet over the Arabic one. So I'm going to reveal to you in a little bit why I think his mission statement was misleading, and it wasn't really truthful to the actual aims of the conference. But first, I want to touch upon why Baku, right? Why is this being set? Why is this being used to set the tempo in Central Asia, which is all the way over here, right? The population centers of Central Asia, some of them are here, right, just south of the Aral Sea, in Urganch. But many of them, I would say the majority, existed all the way over here, right? And that's quite a bit distance from Baku. And they're quite distinct culturally speaking, despite the fact that they are both Turkic-speaking peoples. So I do need to mention that both Tatarstan and Azerbaijan became important nexuses of Russian interaction with the Turks. Although Central Asians did frequently play a role in this regard, many of the cultural and linguistic policies were simply relegated to either the Tatars, which are up here. I think they got cut off in the map, but just think of them as somewhat north. And then it was either the Tatars in Tatarstan or it was in Azerbaijan, right? These were the two nexuses that the Russians used to look at Central Asia. And so we're going to see this play out in the future as well. When the Azeri decision to adopt a Tatar alphabet was imposed on this whole region of Central Asia. So the coordination between Russia and Azerbaijan also had a more urgent aspect to it too. That was to prevent a scenario where Azerbaijani land could be retaken by Iran. So Azerbaijan used to be part of Iran for, I guess, hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it was so until 1813, when the Russians conquered it from Iran. And so, although Iran was weak at the time of all these events, a contingency was still put in place to prevent an Iranian takeover of Azerbaijan in the future. And so one very important aspect of this was just cementing the divide between Iran and Azerbaijan. Now, you may be saying to yourself, how similar could Iran and Azerbaijan be? What could the threat possibly have been? Well, the threat was actually quite substantial. Maybe not at the time, because Iran was being ruled by an inept and weak and corrupt government, but the majority of the world's Azerbaijani population actually lives within Iran, not in Azerbaijan. Azeris are a minority of their own ethnicity or of their own group. And Azerbaijan only has around 36% of the Azeri population. And this is the land that was conquered by Russia. So Azerbaijan, historically, was actually located in Iran. This is where 64% of the Azeris live. The territory that Russia conquered was in antiquity called Aran or Shirvan in the regional dialect or regional language. And so I think you can see that there were actually quite a few links between Iran and Azerbaijan. And Tabriz or Iranian Azerbaijan was really 50% of, I think, Persia's spirit. Because many of the dynasties of Iran at the time still were actually Turkic in nature. So there were also many cultural ties between not even between Iranian Azeris and Azerbaijani Azeris, but also between, Azerbaijani Azeris and Persians as well. So everything I've listed for you here is something it's a shared commonality between Azerbaijani Turkic speakers in Azerbaijan, and then also Persians as well, right? So forget Iranian Azeris, forget Iranian Turks. We are now talking about Iranian Persians as well, right? And these are all aspects of culture that you don't see Azerbaijan sharing with Turkey at all. Almost all of the Azerbaijani food, like sabzi kavrama, which is orme sabzi in Persian, religious elements, like as in Shia Islam, even ice cream. It's not exactly ice cream, but it's a type of frozen delicacy called falude, and Nowruz, which is very important in both Azerbaijan and Iran, but was banned in Turkey for a few decades, right? So you can see that Azerbaijan and Iran are actually quite a bit closer than even Azerbaijan and Turkey are. And you'll also see that secular Azeris, they cluster more with secular Iranians, culturally speaking, and religious Azeris would also cluster more with religious Iranians, again, culturally and religiously speaking. However, the tie between Azerbaijan and Turkey was linguistic, right? So even though Azerbaijan and Turkey were not that similar culturally speaking, and historically, though, they were quite enemies because Azerbaijan was sort of the head of the Safavid Empire, which fought many times with the Ottoman Empire. Linguistically speaking, though, there were actually quite a few similarities. And this is an interesting point that is often lost to history. But the Azerbaijani Arabic alphabet and the Ottoman alphabet were very similar. I want to say maybe anywhere between 80 to 90% of the words were written almost the exact same way, right? Mutual intelligibility, mutual spoken intelligibility was far less. It's more today because of Azeri exposure to Turkish TV, but back in the day it was less, it was harder to understand. But anyways, the point is that you can read Azerbaijani in the Ottoman with a Turkish accent, right? If you're reading the Arabic alphabet, if you know Ottoman Turkish, you can read this very, very easily. Many of the words are spelled the same. It's hard to figure out how much this was due because of a coincidence. The Islamic Army of the Caucasus, which was the Ottoman military, did liberate Baku from the Russians, but that was like in that was sometime during World War I. I don't believe that was enough to really change Azeri literary history. But, nonetheless, the basic point I want to bring up is that Azerbaijani and the Arabic alphabet and then the Ottoman Turkish alphabet were very, very similar. And in fact, the Ottoman alphabet was more suited to Azerbaijani phonetics than it was even to Istanbul Turkish phonetics. So that's just an interesting fact. They were very, very much related. And I think this was a cultural or linguistic cord that the Soviets sought to cut. Because the Ottoman Turks were the enemies of the Russians at the time, and they were fighting each other in World War I. And so separating Azerbaijan from both Iran and Turkey was a high priority for the USSR. Oh, my mistake. Sorry. And then the last point I want to make is that Azerbaijan's Latinization initiatives were actually the event that gave reformers in Turkey enough strength and momentum to change their alphabet. So at the time, Turkey was very hostile to notions such as pan-Islamism or pan-Turkism. And so the literary link between Azerbaijan and Turkey were not that important. It wasn't important to the Azeri SSR, and it wasn't important to the Turkish Republic. And so although they were both civic nationalist governments that sort of promoted the linguistic interests of the dominant ethnic group, they still didn't see themselves similar enough to consider the other to fall under their definition of majority ethnic group. And so that's why the decision was made to sort of cut the cord here. So I want to go back to the Baku conference and the results of this. The Baku conference took place for about 8 days from February 26th to March 5th. And the decision was ultimately made to transition from the Latin alphabet to from the Arabic alphabet to the Latin alphabet for all Turkic languages within the USSR. And this conference was cited as the academic rationale for the alphabet change in Central Asia. Now, I do want to address the problematic aspects of the Congress, was that although the Baku conference is often hailed as a watershed moment where, seasoned academic debate and logical and scientific discourse produced a work of high integrity, there are a few things that cast doubt on the Congress. And so the first troublesome issue was that the script change was never actually up for debate. They claimed that this was a debate between Arabic and Latin alphabet, but this wasn't entirely true. This conference was organized, again, by the head of the Azeri SSR, whose personal mission it was to Latinize the Turkic languages. He was not somebody who was open to debate. In fact, he was actually already pitching that idea of Latinization to Lenin personally. So we know his views on the matter, and he's the one who organizes the conference. And so contrary to the claims being made, there was no debate to be had. And the Soviet Union would not have allowed the linguistic conference if there was any possibility that the language policy was going to be upset. And so the other point of contention I have with the conference was some statements that were made by Latinization supporters, such as this. I'll read it out for you. And so Samad Agha, who again was a supporter of Latinization and he organized the 1926 Baku conference, he made the statement that the Arabic alphabet is composed of only sticks. If you take out the dots, you're left with sticks. How can you reform an alphabet that only has sticks? The Latin alphabet has sticks and circles, enabling you to create a huge number of combinations with it. So I don't want to, forego my impartiality in the matter, but this, I don't even know what this means. This is a completely meaningless statement. I really don't know what else to say about it. I think it betrays his profound ignorance of the richness of the phonetic scripts that were already available to Central Asians. Not only is this statement meaningless, but it has no academic or scientific merit. And it's also factually incorrect. Baitursun had already created a phonetic Arabic alphabet for the Kazakh language. And I really wish I could see his reaction at the time to hearing this, right? Because I can only imagine what he felt, right? Being dragged all the way to Baku and then being told this by the organizer of this supposedly academic linguistic conference. So we do know, actually, his thoughts on the matter because we have the quotes right here. I'm not going to read the whole quote for you, but the gist, if you want, you can sort of pause the live stream and watch it here. But what he basically says is that we don't have any need to Latinize right now. We already have the capability of reflecting the sounds, and we already have the phonetic alphabet. And he knows this because he's the one who created he's the one who created the phonetic Arabic alphabet. And so he's also making the statement that we have many other problems, right? Printing books and compiling dictionaries. And there's many other infrastructure problems that people have, real issues. We should not be sitting here debating the script or even an issue that has already been fixed. He'd basically already fixed the problem, and then he's being sort of dragged to Baku to fix some other imaginary problems, right? So he was actually in opposition to what Samad Agha was suggesting. So let me give you the outcome of the Baku conference. So the second issue that I have with the conference was that it didn't produce any novel or unique idea. The Baku conference basically said that, okay, definitively, we are switching to the Arabic alphabet. But instead of creating a new and unique alphabet for various Turkic languages, it was basically decided that the 1924 Tatar Latin alphabet would be imposed on the rest of the Central Asian languages. So I think on second look, we can, with more confidence, say that the conference seems to have been simply organized to offer academic veneer or dressing to a fundamentally unscientific conclusion, and that was that the Arabic alphabet was not phonetic enough or that it was incapable of representing Turkic languages. We can just dismiss this allegation as false because we know otherwise. And let me actually just show you why. I'm not going to even tell you. But so again, the lack of the originality speaks for itself. This was a Tatar Latin alphabet. The result of 8 days of that conference was simply to tell all the other Central Asian republics, or all the other Central Asian languages, to use this, to simply use the Tatar alphabet. So that's what they did. From Azerbaijan to Uzbekistan to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and even Tajikistan. You know, ironically, I need to say this. I think this Tatar Latin alphabet actually worked pretty well for Tajik. I don't know about the other ones. My opinion is that it didn't work that well because it had all sorts of weird symbols. But it actually did work quite well for Tajik, which is not Turkic language. It's an Iranian. Tajik is actually just Persian. It is the same language as Iranian Persian, just written in a different alphabet. But I think the Latin alphabet actually worked for Tajikistan quite well. It was for everything else that I don't think it did. But anyways, this is what they did, and it was simply recycled and copied and pasted onto every other Central Asian language. And when I say copy and paste, I truly mean copy and paste. So it wasn't just Kazakhstan that had a phonetic Arabic script. Kyrgyz, Tatar, and Uzbek also had phonetic Arabic scripts by this point. Uyghur did it as well, but I don't think Uyghur was really within the Soviet Union's borders. So I'm not addressing that. But everything you see here is completely phonetic. And what happened was that the Latin was copied and pasted right over it. So literally, letter for letter, the Latin alphabet was simply just copying it. It was literally just a copy and paste job. So essentially, they made the statement that these alphabets were not good, and they needed to be changed because they are bad. And so, therefore, we will copy them. I don't know if that doesn't make any sense, right? So you can see very easily here, even more proof, that the Latin and then later, after 1940, the Cyrillic alphabet was just a redressed version of the Latin alphabet. And you can see a one-to-one letter correspondence here, almost entirely. This was created almost 2 decades before this was, maybe even 3, right? This is 30 years before this. So the Cyrillic alphabet that Kazakhstan uses today was actually based off of the Arabic alphabet that was first created. And they claimed the Arabic alphabet was bad, but then they used it as the basis of almost all future projects. Now, I've covered a few reasons why I think the alphabet changes were done in bad faith, and going ahead, I don't think it's productive to get stuck on the idea, though I think it just needed to be stressed as far as Central Asia goes. Today is a different time. The Soviet Union is no longer with us, and Kazakhstan is writing in the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, I made this slide because I wanted to talk about the future direction of the Kazakh language. With a lot of talk revolving around the script changes for Kazakhstan, I think it's only prudent that I give my own input, and that is that the only really culturally attuned script for Kazakhstan is either the Old Turkic alphabet, which is, I think, truly you can consider it a Central Asian creation, and if there was any script that Kazakhstan had definitive ownership of, I would say it's this one, right? So this has a special place in Kazakh culture. It is uniquely sort of belongs to them. And I've already talked about the Arabic alphabet, So I'm not going to talk about this anymore. Let me move on to Cyrillic, right? And so now with all the talk of Latinization in Kazakhstan again, in my mind, my opinion on the Cyrillic alphabet is that it's really the only other alternative. Since Cyrillic was a script that ushered in the literate age for the vast majority of Central Asians, right? So Arabic the Arabic alphabet was there when Kazakhstan was awakening into its own and was defining itself, and a lot of new scientific terminology was built. So the Arabic script built the basis for most of modern Kazakh language. But the majority of Kazakh people didn't become literate until it was the Cyrillic, until it was on the period of the Cyrillic alphabet. And so the Cyrillic alphabet was a custodian, or it oversaw the collective gain of literate national consciousness. From a historical perspective, the Latin doesn't have any of these historical merits to it. At the time of implementation, the Latin alphabet was simply being used as a tool to divide ancestrally common people, and it's my opinion that Kazakhstan will not be reclaiming any meaningful cultural heritage by distancing from Cyrillic and embracing Latin. So I think the only alternative, in my view, going forward for Kazakhstan is to either remain with the Cyrillic script or to go back to the Arabic script, the Tote Jazu, which the modern Cyrillic script is based off of. Again, as I've mentioned for you, that it's quite paradoxical as to why future changes were suggested to this. Tote Jazu was a perfectly phonetic script. It was so good that they decided to copy it, right? So I think in lieu of these alphabet reforms, it should be clear to see that the change from Arabic to Latin was not a scientific or a technical decision. It was a purely political one. The Arabic alphabet was actually better and more comprehensible because it didn't have any extra symbol that didn't exist in the Kazakh language, right? The Cyrillic alphabet has many different symbols that exist only in Russian and are never used in Kazakh. And so this change was a purely political move. And the reason I bring up the Tote Jazu, the Ahmet Batursunov script, is because this, which was the first phonetic alphabet that was created for the Kazakh people, is actually still being used in China today by a 2 million strong Kazakh population. So although the modern political situation in China is a little bit different, and I don't want to get too political here. By talking about the Uyghurs, I'm speaking very strictly about the Kazakh people. I understand that the political situation in China has changed a little bit, but historically speaking, at least during the time, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, many people, many Central Asians, and Kazakhs included, did flee the Soviet Union, and they fled to China. And China is historically the place where many aspects of Kazakh culture are still preserved today. That may not be as common in Kazakhstan proper anymore, but they found a lot of cultural and linguistic traditions found refuge in China. And don't skewer me on this. This is, I think, simply a mosque in that region. Of course, it has some Chinese architecture, which I think is actually, I think it's quite cool. You saw a lot of Persian influence in Uzbekistan, but in China, well, they kind of do their own thing. I like the aesthetic. I think it's kind of nice. But let me move on. And I think it does need to be said that Ahmet Batursunov's legacy remains alive and well with the Chinese Kazakhs, as they use his alphabet as the official orthography of their autonomous territories. Right? So within all these counties and prefectures, the alphabet that Ahmet Batursunov created is actually in active use. It is the only official script and alphabet that they use today. So this being aside, I think, again, if Kazakhstan wants to regain some cultural legacy, it would, or kind of distance itself from Russia, I think this would be the proper script to do it with. As like the father of most scientific Kazakh linguistics created it, and it's still good enough that's being used today and was used as the basis of the current alphabet. Crack ideas that different scripts are possible but highly impractical at this point. I think, however, more research needs to be conducted to shed light on the alternatives. Well, now we can take a little bit of a break. I think that was really the majority of what I wanted to present on. So this was sort of, I think, this was sort of where we can, I don't want to say end because there's still many to say. And let me actually go back now and read some of the comments. You need to keep in mind that there's a maybe 10 to 20-second delay here. So let me just react to some of the questions that are being posited here. Okay, so Zanu, DA9711, let me just get back to you. Let me address some of your points. So let me just go back a few things. Okay, I think we can stop by over here. Unfortunately, I didn't include the Arabic alphabet that the modern Azeri people in Iran use today. But I wouldn't say that the majority of South Azeris have a deep familiarity with the Latin alphabet. Those who really want to learn it will of course learn it, and there are a few people who do know it. Right? That's not up for debate. But I think the overwhelming cases, unless they're really learning or they're really interested in learning about English, which is not really related to Azeri, they generally don't tend to learn or use the Latin alphabet. Almost all printology and pretty much all of the work being done in Iranian Azerbaijan in the Turkish language is done so in the Arabic alphabet. So I think Latin is always sort of secondary in Iran. So that's just one point. So Ilhan, I know you mentioned that Kazakhs were put in camps, and this is correct. In the 1930s, millions of Kazakhs were killed in a famine. And also today in China, this is also the case. Uyghurs are not necessarily alone. Kazakhs and Kyrgyz also do tend to kind of get looped into this. But anyways, let me just move on, actually, because I do want to still make the last points over here. And then I'll get back to the questions later. So that let's talk a little bit about the pre-reform alphabet. This is the alphabet that Baitursunov had fixed and that was unphonetic and maybe not a good fit for the Turkic languages. So over here, this is the script that we have. This was not phonetic. İske imla was, let me just reiterate, right? This had a lot of Arabic and Persian letters that it didn't exist in Turkic Central Asian languages. However, I reject the assertion that this script was fundamentally broken. It was simply a matter of different priorities. So İske imla is the unphonetic script. This is the one that was not catered to Central Asian phonetics and did not cater to Turkic phonetics. Yanga imla was the one that was perfectly phonetic. This had no extra Arabic or Persian letters and only had Turkic letters, basically. And it can be thought of as a one-to-one correspondence of the modern Arabic alphabet. So this was just simply a matter of different priorities. And I wouldn't really say that either script was bad, right? If you look at some traditionalists, they would say that, oh, Yanga imla is too much of an innovation and it doesn't allow any of the Central Asians to have good written mutual intelligibility. And the claim is made that Yanga imla divides people and that İske imla is what unites people, right? Because İske imla has many similar writings and İske imla has many similar spellings between various languages, and Yanga imla doesn't. That's the claim that's made. But I think they both have a place in history. Sorry, they both have a place with the Turkic languages. So let me go into why. And that's because Chagatai, or İske İmla, it was made to sort of unite many different people. This is a map of Central Asia, not necessarily the Turkic parts, but let's just look within the black lines, right? Over here, Chagatai and İske İmla were sort of used to unite and bind all of these people. Because the script wasn't phonetic, it was very flexible. It allowed many different people to learn and use it. It wasn't good for any of them, individually speaking, but overall, it was a sort of lingua franca, right? So Yaga İmla, the phonetic one, was more used to cater to the different varieties and the diverse nature of these languages, right? So Kazakh, Kyrgyz, which is over here, Uzbek, Turkmen, Azeri, and then Tatar over here. Where's Tatar? Right over here. And Bashkort as well. I can't forget them. So Bashkort, Tatar, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uyghur, Uzbek, and Turkmen, they all had their sort of phonetic scripts like Yaga İmla, right? The situation here, I think, can be very much compared to the situation in the Arab world, right? Central Asia doesn't have all that much relation with the Arab world. I'm not making a cultural point, but I'm making a linguistic point, right? So at the top right over here, we see the territories where modern standard Arabic is used today, okay? Modern standard Arabic is spoken by nobody, natively speaking, right? Modern standard Arabic is not a natural language. It is sort of an artificial uniting language, a lingua franca, right? MSA allows somebody from Morocco to speak to somebody from Iraq. But if you look at the actual regional dialects, and they're called Arabic dialects, but the truth is that these Arabic dialects are more different from each other than even Central Asian languages are, right? So the regions here are the Maghreb, former Greater Egypt, the Horn of Africa, the Persian Gulf Arabic languages, and then the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levantine Arabic languages, right? These are all very different from each other. And the natural Arabic dialects here can really be thought of as comparable to the Central Asian languages, right? Like maybe take this as like the analog of Kazakhstan, and Tunisia is the analog of Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, and so on and so forth, right? That's how I want you to think of this. So basically, the Arab world has two languages. It has each a local language, and then it also has a modern standard Arabic, which is the lingua franca. And that's what exactly was being used here. This was a local language, and this was the lingua franca. So let me now go on and talk a little bit about the pre-reform orthography. So I'm talking about İske İmla. I'm talking about the Kazakh version of İske İmla. So the difference was that all vowels were represented in the modern one, diphthongs were clarified, and all unnecessary Arabic and Persian letters were completely removed, right? They don't have a place in Kazakh phonetics, and so we can like get rid of them. They're not relevant, and we'll do away with them, and that's all good and dandy. So let me speak to you very, very briefly about vowel harmony, especially as it's relevant to the Kazakh language. So in modern Kazakh, in the Cyrillic alphabet, we use all these different letters for hard and soft vowels, right? I'm not going to even try to pronounce these with a Kazakh accent. So I'll be having a bit of a Turkish accent. But here we have a, o, o, and here we have a, e, I, ö, u, right? These are the vowels. Now, historically, we also have hard and soft consonants. So the k and r here usually cluster with these hard vowels, right? And k and ge cluster with these soft consonants. And so both the Old Turkic alphabet and the Arabic alphabet also made these distinct, just like Cyrillic alphabet does, right? So here we see that the decision was made in Ahmet Baytursun's alphabet to simply define, to simply have each of these letters as one, and a unique marker, it was called Hamze, was being used at the beginning of a word to differentiate, right? So this is what we have in, this is what we have. Before you think that this is not phonetic or it doesn't work, let me kind of dispel that myth for you. There was a special marker that was put at the beginning of all words that would tell you, right? If you didn't see that marker, you would assume that it's a hard vowel. But if you saw that special mark at the beginning of a word, you would know that it's a soft vowel. And this mark is always written in, and I'll show you an example in the future if I can. But it was pretty much completely phonetic. It was very good. And so this is the old script. This is the non-phonetic script. Alif was still being used. The hard version was a, and the soft version was a. Was a short. This was a short vowel, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. The letter ye, which is a squiggly line over here, was also the same. And generally, I think the point I just simply want to make here is that these letters were defined by the context that they appeared in, right? If we have the soft or hard consonants, then it would influence the hard or soft pronunciation. And I kind of want to, again, prove to you that elif, which is a in all other languages. So in Turkish, this would be kar, but in Kazakh, theoretically, if they had this word, it would be pronounced kar, because it's a soft environment. That's what I'm getting at here. The soft environment of alif is a. But in Turkish, the soft environment for alif is just a. It's still a, right? It doesn't change. It only changes in Kazakh. So now, moving on to Turkic vowels. Uzbek, Uyghur, and Azeri are good. They kind of work with the traditional non-phonetic Arabic alphabet very well in this regard. So this Turkey script, this is what we call in Turkish, in Ottoman Turkish, a üstün. This makes the a sound in Uzbek, Uyghur, and Azeri. This letter, which is a letter ye, which has two dots beneath it, makes the e sound, and alif over here makes the a sound, right? So, in words of Turkic origin, which is only Turkic origin, we have the üstün here making the e sound in both Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and also Turkish and Turkmen. But in Azeri, again, look at the difference between Azeri and Turkish. So, if we look at this letter over here, this is e. In Kazakh, this also makes the e sound. And with elif over here, the soft version is a. But in Kyrgyz, we don't have this variation. We only have a. Same in Turkish and Turkmen. So, the Turkic pronunciation of this üstün is different. Turkic pronunciation is e in Kazakh, but the Persian and Arabic üstün is pronounced in Kipchak languages as a, right? So if we find this letter in a Turkic word, this is the sound it makes. If you find it in a Persian and Arabic word, this is the sound it makes, right? This, which we call esre in Ottoman Turkish, is consistent throughout all of the languages. And this, which is called ötre, in Oghuz, it's usually seen as a front vowel. But in Karluk and Kipchak languages, it tends to represent the back vowel. And in Tatar, it's also a front vowel, but makes the ö sound. But again, it's completely dependent on the hard and soft consonants here. And I think one note I need to clarify for you guys is the reason I'm using hard and soft for the vowels instead of back and front is because I want to sort of show the relationship that these consonants have with the vowels, right? In a word of Turkic origin, we generally don't see hard consonants mixing with a soft vowel. So I want to bring that point home. I know full well it's called front vowel and back vowel, but I just wanted to sort of show the relationship. Okay, anyways, and I guess I'm just comparing it for you here. In Persian and Arabic, this üstün makes the a sound. In Turkic, this also makes the a sound for Azeri, Uzbek, Uyghur, and Tatar. But when we get to Kipchak languages, then it makes a difference, right? Whether a word is of Persian and Arabic origin, or it's a word of Turkic origin. So I can go over the pre-Reform Arabic alphabet in a little bit more detail. I don't know how much you guys want to see that. So these were, if you're interested in it at all, our group has done a bit of research Uh, so let's see here. So just to address Zanu's point, being unphonetic is not an issue. The French alphabet and both the English alphabet that you are currently writing in, like right now in this comment section, are fundamentally unphonetic. It's a problem, but it's not the biggest problem. The highest priority should always be intelligibility, right? How serviceable is that script? Even a script like Chinese, which unites many different dialects, if you will, that completely have no spoken intelligibility, they use a very unphonetic script and it works very well for them. So being non-phonetic is not necessarily a flaw. It's being used to unite many different peoples. Of course, if you have an unphonetic script for a very small group of people, that's a little bit different, right? Because not only are you not allowed to communicate with a large amount of people, but it also just doesn't help you either. So that's one point I wanted to make. So let me just go back here. Okay. And so, Zanu, to also address one of your points, is that in terms of, for this part, all of this is original research. This was not cited or found in any other journal or any other academic source. This is the work that I personally and me and my group did by poring over old Kazakh manuscripts and comparing their words to Arabic and Persian loanwords. So that's what a lot of this is. A lot of this is actually original research that I'm presenting over here, right? Showing the difference between Persian Arabic, and then Turkic words in Kipchak languages. See, otherwise we can use the same letter for both Oghuz and Karluk languages, but when we get to Kipchak, again, Persian and Arabic words pronounce this as A, and then in Turkic words we pronounce it as E. This is something that we kind of found. And okay, and also to address your point in the comment section, is that no, it's still a valid comparison. I think so. The Kazakh, the Tote Jazu that was being used over here was quite phonetic, right? So I don't see how it's I don't see how it's a bad script. It works pretty well. Okay, yeah, sure. Posted the sources really low here. The script is quite small. Can you see it? Can you see where I'm pointing to? But I will also be happy to post my sources in the comment section at the end of the video, or at the end of the live stream. Okay, I guess I'll present to you a little bit of my research here. Was that I found that in the initial position in the Kazakh language, where we have zh over here, this tended to cluster with ye in the Arabic alphabet in the pre-reform orthography. So nothing here has anything to do with Ahmed Baytulsun. This is all before his new alphabet. So in maybe the Oriental reading, the Chagatai, the Uzbek or Persian pronunciation of this would be yal, even the Turkish pronunciation. This would be yur, yok, and yul in Turkish. We see this is j, right? Jal, jur, jok, and jil. And so this is simply one thing I wanted to make clear to you. But in the middle position, it remains as ye, right? This is only the beginning of a word initial. This letter is one of those that is completely particular to Arabic. This is not even in Persian. It's just an Arabic letter. I understand why Ahmed Baytulsunov got rid of this. It's not really a useful letter. Nonetheless, I think you can make an argument that this was actually worth keeping in, because there are certain words, right, that are pronounced very differently from Turkish or from Uzbek and Persian to Kazakh and Tatar, right? So in Tatar, this always makes the r sound, right? In Arabic, it has a certain thing, but Arabic is not really relevant here. So the only relevant languages are Persian, Uzbek, Uyghur, Kyrgyz, and the like. And Turkish is also a little bit relevant here too. But so in Persian and Turkish, this is a silent letter. Makes no sound. In Tatar, this does make a sound. It's makes that guttural GH sound, R. So if you have a name like Ali in Persian, or Zeri, it'd be Ghala in Tatar, or Ghali. Don't quote me on the pronunciation, but I'm just trying to bring that point home. So in the Kazakh language, this has two pronunciations, right? One of my theories is that at the beginning of a word, this is a silent letter, and at the end of a syllable, this also makes that guttural GH sound. But you'll see examples that kind of conflict with this. So I can't be certain for sure. This is a point that I'm still working on. I'm trying to understand. My theory is that this pronunciation of this like R actually came from Tatar influence. So I want to move on to two letters over here, and this is Kha and Ha. So this Kha over here, historically, I don't think Turkic languages usually had this. You find it in Azeri, but I'm really talking about Kazakh, right? I think it's pronounced more like a Q sound, like Kh. It does get represented as X, it does get represented as Kha in some Kazakh words. Like even Ahmed, well, that's a bit of a different letter, but it does get pronounced as Kha in a few Kazakh words, and it's generally pronounced as Kha as well. But it's pronounced as Ha in Turkish and pronounced as Kha in Persian. So it has, again, two pronunciations in Kazakh. This letter over here is just a normal H sound in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Tatar. In Kazakh, it usually tends to be silent, but sometimes it does make the H sound. Over here, we see this is the Arabic, this is a guttural letter, Ha. And I guess to respond to some of the things in the comment section, I do need to make it clear I'm not really biased against the Latin alphabet. I think it works quite well for Turkish. That was a decision that Turkey made on their own. But when it came to the Central Asian languages, they were already being written in a phonetic alphabet, and the change wasn't really that important to be made. So that's just my stance on it. In Turkey, they made it on their own, and Ottoman Turkish was it had a lot of issues with it, and it had a very, very heavy usage of Persian and Arabic words, which were not written by any spelling rule. An Ottoman Turkish learner had to memorize all of the Arabic and Persian words, and there was no real system that they could use. If they heard a new word that wasn't of Turkic origin, they would have to simply memorize it. So in Ottoman Turkish, I think you can see the rationale for why they switched. But for Kazakhstan, they already actually did have a phonetic Arabic alphabet. So the need for their Latinization really wasn't that pertinent. And I think furthermore for Azerbaijan, it was also being used as a means to divide North and Southern Azerbaijan. So that's also the problematic relationship that I think Latin had with the Soviet Union's Turkic peoples. But anyways, let me move on. This is a letter that's specific to Arabic, not found in Persian either. It's pronounced differently again. In Kazakhstan, I've seen three different pronunciations. It's either silent, makes this kha sound, or it's kind of like that Q sound, like kha. In Uzbek and Tatar, it's almost always kha. So you'll see certain words that kind of preserve this. This is shun in Tatar. Kazakh usually doesn't pronounce this. It's pronounced like a s, like a very normal S sound. That's the only point I want to make. Same here. These two letters, j and zh, are not differentiated in either Kazakh or Kyrgyz. You could possibly find a phonetic interpretation of this for Russian, but it's not really. Yeah, this is a redundant letter. It's a Persian letter. It doesn't exist in Arabic, but it doesn't do any good for the Turkic languages over here. And this is the letter F, F. In Kazakh and Kyrgyz, it usually makes a P sound, but in all the other languages, it's pronounced just fine. Sometimes in a very modernist, for Kazakhs who are trying to be faithful to Arabic phonology, they do pronounce words which would have historically had this letter, and they pronounce them technically correctly, but again, I just want to indicate that there's a controversy over here between the two. And then last point I need to make is that suffix consonants in the pre-reform Arabic script, that is the one that Ahmed Baitursunov didn't create, these letters over here, these consonants, were pronounced in either 2 to 4 different ways, right? This L over here, lar, it's pronounced as L, T, or D, and it's completely dependent on whether or not it's being followed by a vowel or by a consonant, right? Over here, if we see if there's a vowel before the suffix, it's pronounced as an N, and if there is a consonant, it's pronounced as a T. Or if it's a voiceless consonant, it's pronounced as a T, but if it's a voiced consonant, it's pronounced as a D. And this carries true for almost all of them here. The only difference being D over here, that the only variation is that it gets voiced and devoiced. It doesn't change the pronunciation. But that's really all I wanted to say. So I wanted to welcome you to our group. But before I move on, let me actually go back and address some more of the comments. And so yes, the Kazakh Latin alphabet right now is being a decision made for themselves, but I'm looking at the historical precedents. And I think that there is more cultural heritage to be reclaimed by switching over to alphabet that is currently being used by Kazakhs that we see over here, right? Latin isn't being used by anyone. I think that it would be resource intensive to switch from Cyrillic. So my first preference would be for Kazakhstan to remain with the Cyrillic alphabet. I understand your people's issues with extra letters that Cyrillic has, but I think ultimately it's just what's more economical. This is what everybody in Kazakhstan has been raised with. It's not a bad alphabet at all. It's quite serviceable. If you really wanted to, you could just change the Russian words in Kazakh and Kazakhify them. But either way, I'm not going to really die on that hill. So what I'm saying is that if you absolutely must, right, at all costs, leave the Cyrillic alphabet for whatever reason or the other, the Arabic alphabet that is already used in China and that was created by Ahmed Baitursunov is perfectly good, right? It's phonetic. It doesn't have that many. I don't think it has anything more than maybe 1 or 2 Russian letters, and it's currently being used today. And so if Kazakhstan did switch to this, they would then find commonality between themselves and the Kazakhs in China. It's 2 million people. It's not really that insignificant. Kazakhstan today is around 18 million, of which I believe 16 million are ethnic Kazakhs. Don't quote me on that, though. I don't have the numbers in front of me officially. So if I'm wrong, please let me know. I'd be happy to be corrected. But that's just my point that I'm making. And Zanu, again, to address your point about South Azerbaijanis, so Akhundzadeh was attempting, he was looking at this from a phonetic perspective. He was just purely an academic, right? Akhundzadeh didn't, I think he was the one who submitted the Azeri alphabet change to Latin, and it was rejected on religious grounds, which is why in the future, with the USSR being more secular, they were like, okay, we're not going to take religion into the equation, which is fine, right? I think religion doesn't really have any place in linguistics. Religion doesn't have any place in linguistics. It's not a consideration that should be made. And linguistic decisions need to be made from a scientific perspective, not from this sort of religious or even political perspective. And so even though Akhundzadeh didn't want to maybe divide anyone, Samet Agha definitely did. And he did so, again, because the huge commonalities between North and South Azerbaijan. And Musavat, which was the party that was there before, which was there during the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic, a lot of their ideology was like civic nationalism. And the calculation was made that their government or their sort of party would become completely irrelevant if it was subsumed by Iran, right? Basically, the ADR government would have no reason to exist if the Iranians somehow came back for it. And all of the Azeris still identified with their southern brethren. So that's basically the point I'm making over here. And also, I need to just also add as a personal anecdote, I don't know any South Azerbaijanis who, I mean, personally, I'm saying, I'm not talking about people on the internet, but I don't know any South Azerbaijanis who took a huge interest in the Latin Azerbaijani alphabet. They all, of course, know Latin, but that's because they live either in the United States or they already speak English. But I do know South Azeris who know the English Latin alphabet, and also the Turkish Arabic alphabet, but don't know Azeri Latin because it's not always that big for them. Okay, so now let me move on to the very sort of the end of the presentation. I just wanted to welcome you all to the Anka group. We're a group specializing in the production of West and Central Asian media, linguistics, history, and culture. This linguistics presentation was really my own thing, and I'm presenting it to you under this as a part of this group. In the future, we will not be only doing this type of stuff. We will have also more songs and linguistic history and culture. So just look forward to that. So we have a few groups that we have that are working on our stuff. We will cover linguistic history extensively, as I've already kind of shown you some of the products of my own research. We will be doing research on pre-reform alphabets, and we're trying to unlock the spelling rules, a bit of a typo here, but unlock the spelling rules of Chagatai. And then we will work on Old Turkic runes next, because I think this is a very interesting field that doesn't have too much. I think I've tried and I've failed to find YouTube tutorials, at least in English, that do teach how to write in Old Turkic. And it's a very interesting script. I think it's very cool and it's worth learning about, especially if you're interested in Central Asian languages. So after we're done with the pre-reform alphabets and Chagatai, we hope to do Old Turkic runes next. And we will be making videos and presentations of our research. And in the future, those videos and presentations won't really have any history or political dimension to them. They'll be purely academic. So we'll just present the findings in our research. We also do have a media group where we will be translating traditional and modern Central Asian songs. And the linguistic group, we hope, will provide lyrics and unique orthographies, such as pre-reform alphabets, Tötejazu, and also Old Turkic runes. Old Turkic runes and the modern Turkic languages don't necessarily have the best sort of lineup. It's a little bit hard to see. But regardless, I think it's worth attempting. So, but we'll see. We'll see what we can find with our research, and then we'll present it. And then we will also have creative information, informative presentations on videos on Central Asian culture for foreign audiences. So we are attempting to promote Central Asia to a foreign audience in both English, Russian, and Persian. We do hope to have other languages to follow, especially even possibly Chinese. But regardless, I think that this is one of our goals here. And maybe a very, very long-term goal is to encourage more foreign interest and possibly tourism and travel. And we will also have a history group, but this is a bit new. So in terms of our process architecture, we have been thus far coordinating on Discord. We will be publishing our content and research on social media platforms like Telegram, VK, YouTube, and Discord. And we will be publishing the progress of our linguistic work on websites like Notion. And if you're interested, I can put the links to our channels in the comment section below. So I highly recommend that you join. We are always looking for new people and volunteers. Nobody here is working for any money, unfortunately. I wish we got paid to do this, but we don't, unfortunately. And we'd really be grateful if you can contribute whatever you can. Some good resources that we have here. Our music channel. And there's another guy named Adrian May who currently teaches Tötejazu in English. So I'll link his videos as well. But aside from that, I think that takes us to the end of the presentation. Let me just very quickly address any of the comments that I have left here. And I don't see anything new. So I will end the presentation here, and I thank you all for watching. It's been nice having you guys. And thank you very much. And I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.